Hi everybody, welcome back. In this next sequence of videos, we're going to be talking about consumer and producer surplus and efficiency, where we think about efficiency as one of the ways we measure how well an allocation of resources in an economy does to maximize the benefits to consumers and producers, which we measure through consumer and producer surplus. So in this first video, we're going to introduce some of the ideas, and then we'll go into consumer surplus, producer surplus, talk about efficiency, and then tie that back into some of our previous ideas about economic systems and essentially free markets and market-based economies. Okay, so let's jump in here. We're going to start with welfare economics. This is the field which all of this falls under. It's a subfield of economics. And what we're really thinking about here is the study of how the allocation of resources affects economic well-being. So the study of how the allocation of resources affects economic well-being. Okay, and so specifically here we're thinking about consumers and producers. Consumers with consumer surplus, producers with producer surplus, and both of them combined make total surplus. Okay, so we're going to start with consumers. I'll introduce a couple ideas here about willingness to pay, and then once we get fully into consumer surplus, we'll make a full video out of that one. But willingness to pay, abbreviated WTP, is the maximum amount a buyer is willing to pay for a good. The maximum amount a buyer is willing to pay for a good. Okay, and so this is a dollar amount. That's the unit. And we can look at this through an example. So we've got 4 people here, Anthony, Chad, Flea, and John. And this is their willingness to pay for an iPod. Okay, Flea is willing to pay the most at $300. And we're gonna keep coming back to this table. So try to remember these numbers. Flea is willing to pay $300. Next is Anthony at $250, $175, $125. Okay, and so if the price is $200, who is going to be willing to buy an iPod, and what is the quantity demanded among these 4? So the price of $200 means that if Anthony is willing to pay $250, then he'll definitely buy it for $200. It's cheaper than what he's willing to pay. And Flea is willing to pay $300, so he'll buy it as well. Chad and John will not buy it because the price is greater than what they're willing to pay. So those are the people willing to buy it, and that gives us a quantity demanded of 2. And so we can think about this a little bit more rigorously. And eventually, by aggregating everybody's willingness to pay together, we're going to end up with a demand curve. So if we start out with a demand schedule and we look at who buys at which prices, remember the highest amount somebody was willing to pay was $300. Nobody was willing to pay $301 or higher. So the quantity demanded is 0. Flea was willing to pay up to $300. Next was Anthony, and he was only willing to pay $250. So Anthony is not in, but Flea is in this price range, the only one. So his quantity demanded is 1. If Flea would buy it for $251, he would definitely buy it for cheaper. So actually, we know Flea is going to be in at any lower price. But Anthony joins in. He's willing to pay $2.50. So we have a quantity demanded of 2. And then we have Chad. So Anthony's in. And we have Chad. He's willing to pay $1.75. And John, who's willing to pay $1.25. So John will pay anything from 0 to $1.25. After that, he drops out. Okay, and so through this, we have a demand schedule. We have the relationship between price and quantity demanded. That's what we're after. We can plot that to get a demand curve. And so let's start by starting at the high price of $3.50. Nobody's willing to pay $3.50. Nobody's willing to pay $3.40 or $3.25 or anywhere down to $300. But at $300, Flea is in the market. And so quantity demanded pops up to 1. And he's the only one at $2.90, $2.80, and so on and so forth, down to $2.50. And at $2.50, Anthony is willing to jump in. So the quantity demanded in the market is 2. All right, Anthony's in until $1.75. When Chad pops in, quantity demanded of 3, $1.25. John pops in. And everybody's in for a quantity demanded of 4 at every price up to $1.25. Okay, and so here we have kind of a strange looking demand curve. It's strange looking because there are only 4 people. But eventually, and so let's see this again. Eventually, once we have more people, there are going to be other people who have a higher willingness to pay, and Flea will jump in there still at 300, all right? But then there are going to be a bunch of other people, and as you have more and more, this demand curve is going to get smoother and smoother until eventually it's what we're used to with a nice smooth market demand curve. Okay, and so the other thing that we can see is that this demand curve, and this is important, the demand curve represents each marginal person's willingness to pay. Okay, and so in this case, at a price of 300, Flea enters the market, and that is Flea's willingness to pay. Okay, same thing here. That's Anthony's willingness to pay, and so on and so forth. But the point is, there's a lot of information in the demand curve about the value that people place on goods in a market. And this is true for iPods, it's true for computers, cars, all sorts of goods, even goods that are hard to measure. But inside this demand curve, we have a lot of very kind of personal, intrinsic valuations that people put on things in society. And so that's going to be important as we get toward the end of this set of video lectures. When we bring the consumer surplus, this is eventually going to help us think about consumer surplus. And we're going to bring it together with producer surplus and efficiency. And that's where we're going to come back to this idea of the demand curve uncovering some inherent valuations that people have inside of them. Okay, so we're going to be moving on next to consumer surplus and going through a similar example with the same for people, and then we're going to show how at different prices we can have different consumer surpluses for each of these people. Okay, we're going to do that in the next video. I will see you then. Thanks.